Good evening. It is an incredible honor to be invited, Roshi Joan, to be here tonight. I want to thank you for this humbling invitation. And also thank you for the support and guidance you've given to me and others for the work that we do. Of course, I want to thank my wife, Ann Peterson, for her direction, support, and guidance. Because I wouldn't have the practice I do today without her. And because of the topics I'm talking about today, the cruelty of prisons and the government-sanctioned executions, I have to thank my colleagues who have inspired and supported me, as well as the clients who are really the inspirations for the work that we all do. When Roshi Joan first asked me to do a Dharma talk, I had no idea how timely these topics would be in November of 2020. When it comes to prisoners facing COVID, there are over 200,000 prisoners trapped in cages who have been infected with COVID. Over 1,400 prisoners have died from COVID while trapped in prison. And tomorrow, the federal government will execute another Black human being in Terre Haute, Indiana. So these topics are incredibly timely. And we all have to think about reacting to them and what we can do to alleviate the suffering that represents. I want to talk about prison cruelty and the execution process, but I want to talk about a number of aspects of it. First, I want to talk about how a construction worker, college football player, and repo man became a prison rights advocate and then an opponent of the death penalty. I want to talk about what motivates me and others who do this kind of work, analyze the effects on what we're doing when we're witnessing prison cruelty and the execution process, where I see us headed, why there's reason to be hopeful, believe it or not, what we can do to reduce prison cruelty and eliminate executions and the other actions that I think that'll support these efforts. Over the 45 years or more that I've been involved in this, I've been incredibly lucky and received so many gifts from so many people. So when I think about what motivated me, what attracted me and affected me, I think you can tell by the color of my hair that I lived through the 60s. I grew up in a privileged white sanctuary, rural suburb of Chicago. They had a sunset law. Most of you know what a sunset law is. That means that African Americans had better be out of town by sunset or they would be arrested and who knows what else. It means I witnessed what the Chicago police did to citizens in Chicago and the greater area. I lived through the 1968 Grant Park riot and the Chicago 7 trial. I was there when Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were murdered by the Chicago police with the assistance of our FBI, part of a, believe it or not, a conspiracy involving the Civil Rights Department of the United States Justice Department. You know, people ask, have you ever seen things so crazy? Have there ever been so many people at risk? And I remind people that, yes, even white kids like me had to worry about being killed on college campuses. The governor of California had encouraged the National Guard to inflict violence on protesters. Then in May of 1970, as most of you know, 4 students were shot dead by the National Guard at Kent State University. And 10 days later, 12 students were shot by state police and local police, 2 of whom died. All this happened in the context of the Vietnam draft that took kids my age to Vietnam, 50,000 of whom didn't come back, including a friend of mine who used to eat at my lunch table in high school. This was also in the context of the incredible assassinations that we witnessed and experienced. The Kennedys, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. Did I mention drugs? Well, fortunately, there was some important work being done at that time by doctors Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Ram Dass that got us to focus on set and setting so that we could take time to figure out what was happening to us, what we could do about what was happening to us, what social action we could engage in. You know, we wanted to do something to change the world, but we wanted to do something so that the world wouldn't change us. But as all of you know, of course, when you're involved in engaging, it always changes us. And we have to work so hard to make sure that it changes us for the better. Here, I have to recommend, if you haven't already, to read Roshi Jones' incredible work, Standing at the Edge, to understand the effects of what witnessing suffering does to us and what we can do to make sure that it does change us for the better. It's really an instruction manual for all of us involved in social action. So there I was in the late 60s, early 70s. What could I do? It seemed to me at the time that law school was an obvious answer. And when I went to law school, I was immediately lucky enough to have a mentor, a public defender, an experienced public defender who later went on to be a justice on the New Hampshire Supreme Court, Jim Duggan. Inspired by watching him work and hearing the stories about his clients. And I got a part-time job working as a law clerk, trying to challenge the sentence of a prisoner at the New Hampshire State Prison. A 30-year-old biker who was doing a long sentence, almost that would be his entire life. That was my introduction to prisons, and that's where I started learning about what they were all about. If you want to learn about prisons and what they're really like, I have some things for you to recommend that I recommend that you read. In particular, a wonderful book by Wilbert Rideau, Rideau, In Place of Justice. Wilbert is a Black man who spent 44 years in Angola prison in Louisiana, sentenced to death 3 times, spent most of his time in solitary confinement. And when I say solitary confinement, I'm talking about the worst kind of small stripped cells with no meaningful interaction with human beings. Years and years of solitary confinement, and you can read about his experiences that he witnessed while people around him were being hauled off for executions. Wilbert today works with capital defense teams around the country and their clients. He inspires all of us by the work that he does with our clients, an important part of the work that we could never accomplish without him being involved. He helps our clients negotiate the traumatic path that leads, in some cases, to federal executions. I also have to recommend Philippe Mall's book, Dharma in Hell, because that's what it is, and he tells you why it is. Philippe Mall says that when prisoners arrive, they are sent a very strong message about what it means to be a prisoner. He says, they tell you you're a prisoner, a thug, a criminal, you're not human, you don't count. I have to tell you that in 1973, when I started doing prison work, I might have had some of those same attitudes, but they quickly disappeared. When I was working with my friend Russ Collins, became my friend in the New Hampshire State Prison, I'll never forget talking to him about where he came from, where he grew up. And he started telling me about his parents. And Russ choked up and said that he knew that every night his parents, who'd been married for 37 years, would take a walk through the park across the street from their home holding hands. That's when I knew I was on the right path. That's when I knew what this work could do for us, who were doing it, who were participating in it, who were witnessing it. At the same time, I was seeing the criminal justice system in action and how it treated those people that were going through it. In 1976, I came to Santa Fe, and there again, I was so lucky to have the opportunity to engage in prison work at the penitentiary in New Mexico here in Santa Fe. And once again, I had a wonderful mentor, a man who subsequently became my law partner, Bob Rothstein. And for the first assignment, he sent me to the penitentiary, New Mexico, to investigate claims of cruel and unusual punishment, mostly in the solitary confinement unit at the penitentiary in New Mexico. The solitary confinement unit was surrounded by a prison with about 1,100 prisoners who were experiencing some of the most horrific conditions ever to be experienced by people in United States prisons. I heard firsthand stories about the brutalization of prisoners, of prisoners crawling naked on their hands and knees in concrete floors, surrounded by correctional officers beating them with paddles and batons, cavity searches, cell shakedowns, the shaming, dehumanization that was unimaginable. It pretty much convinced me what I wanted to do for a long time, and I'm still doing it. But I had no idea how quickly I would be thrust deeply into the pain of prison cruelty and its effects, and how quickly I would have to react to it, because no one saw the horrors that we experienced in Santa Fe in February of 1980. What I had witnessed for 4 years leading up to it, in hindsight, sort of explained what we saw. 33 murders that involved prisoner-on-prisoner violence, and some of the most horrific murders imaginable. If you want the details, they're readily accessible on the internet. And as a result of the destruction of the penitentiary and those 33 murders, our public defender office in Santa Fe was responsible for representing everyone facing the death penalty out of that homicide. I got to know all the clients, their families. Our clients were held, and after they got the prison functional again, they were living in the solitary confinement unit that was in part responsible for the violence that we witnessed. And that's where they lived for the years preceding their trials. I got to know the families of the victims, because in our office, we actually had clients killing other clients, and we knew the families on both sides and saw how the victims' families were exploited by the criminal justice process for the purposes of the prosecutions. With 125 prisoners originally facing the death penalty, after the 3 years of trials that took place, no one was sentenced to death. Yeah, there were a lot of people who engaged in a lot of hard work, and a lot of people from outside New Mexico who came and supported us and inspired us to do the work. But most importantly, the results were due to the compassion of the Santa Fe jurors who heard the information and evidence and saw the pictures of what conditions were like here in the penitentiary in New Mexico leading up to the riot. I remember talking to a number of jurors after the trials, and one of them in particular said, "How could we allow the state to impose the ultimate sanction, the taking of a human life, when the state itself was responsible, had created the conditions which caused and created the violence?" It was a message that I learned from a juror that helped me do the work for the next several decades as I got involved in more and more capital proceedings involving prison cruelty. I want to stop for a minute here and talk about the effects of being involved in this work. Thich Nhat Hanh tells us that, he talks about the goodness of suffering, that suffering often generates the understanding and compassion that will help us reduce and relieve suffering. But one of the other effects is anger. Anger. the reaction to want to resist, to challenge, to fight back. But anger, as we know, can be so self-destructive and destructive to the people around us. Yes, I get angry. I get angry when I see a client come to a visiting room with facial bruises that he received from a baton from a correctional officer. I get angry when I see a prosecutor breaking the rules or breaking the law in a courtroom, trying to kill one of our clients. I get angry when a deputy warden threatens to keep me in prison overnight when I complain about my clients not being brought out to my visiting room. You bet. But again, Thich Nhat Hanh tells me how to deal with it. He says, when we feel our anger, we have to cook it a little while. He says it's like cooking potatoes, you know? We don't eat raw potatoes, and we can't act on raw anger. We cook the potatoes until they're done. And as we cook that anger, it turns into positive energy. As an Irish construction foreman once told me, if you eat potatoes in the morning, you can work all day on those potatoes, and that's what those angry potatoes do for us. So there we were. We got done with the riot trials, and we began our work in the New Mexico Corrections Department, trying to remedy the conditions that had led up to the riot with the assistance of the federal courts and a lot of other dedicated people. We inspected the prisons and got to know firsthand what was going on in the prisons in the aftermath of the riot. Ironically, the state of New Mexico decided that it was going to keep riots from occurring in the future by building massive solitary confinement units. Right here in Santa Fe, they built a $22 million, 300-cell solitary confinement unit, which quickly became the focus of our litigation. It was there that we were successful in eliminating some of the effects that were so deeply affecting our clients there. I'd learned about the effects of solitary confinement when I was touring cell block 3 at the old penitentiary around the same time. They were building the new solitary confinement unit across the street, and we were inspecting these strip cells in the basement of cell block 3. Strip cells are small cells that have no bed, no toilet except for a small hole in the concrete floor. That's the toilet. And then if a guard was feeling kind enough, he'd throw a mattress on the floor. We'd walk down the hall, and I remember this one particular day walking down the hall with the Deputy Secretary of Corrections, and they would lift the metal shutters that kept the cells dark. And we looked through the grill after the shutters were lifted. And then about another 6 feet back, there was another set of grills. And then we could see a prisoner on the floor, lying on a mattress on the floor, and the light from behind us lighting it up. And I remember knowing who the prisoner was in that cell, and I told Mr. Wiggins who I was and what I was doing there, and wondered if there was anything we could do for him. And I'll never forget his black face looking up at me and telling me, neuron transplant. Neuron transplant. All I need is a neuron transplant. Can you get me a neuron transplant? Yeah, I knew right then and there I was on the right path and what I was going to be doing for a while. So we did the best we could to try to eliminate the effects of solitary confinement on mentally ill prisoners across the street. That facility still operates today. Solitary confinement. I want to talk about that for a minute. Tell you a little bit about what it's like. Again, I urge you to read Wilbert Rideau's account of what it was like when he was there for decades. This is torture of humans in our name, in our prisons. John McCain and Nelson Mandela say that of all the horrors they experienced in prison, solitary confinement was the worst part of it. You can look at some of the work done by Dr. Craig Haney at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who's written so eloquently about what solitary confinement does to human beings. Our human identity is socially created. We know who we are by interacting with other human beings. That's how we understand who we are. And solitary confinement has this effect on prisoners, whether they're seriously mentally ill or not. They frequently experience hallucinations, depression. They engage in self-harm, cutting, headbanging, feces throwing, and oftentimes suicide. This happens in our prisons. And that's why we have an obligation to bear witness to what's going on and to try to reduce the suffering experienced. Fleet Mall tells us that prison is the definition of hell. It's the absence of understanding and compassion. It's hellish because of the conditions, but it's because of that absence of understanding and compassion and the effects that it has on prisoners. How can we eliminate that hell? Fleet Mall says, when we go there, if we don't engage in a helper-helpy dynamic, don't try to do anything. Simply be present. Give an offering of awareness, your heart, and presence. I'm not doing anything when I'm sitting with a client in a federal supermax, talking to him about what's going on and what we're trying to do in his case. I simply open up and the experience does the rest, takes care of business. As a modern group of philosophers said, well, actually a musical group called Offspring recently said, the more you suffer, the more you show you really care. I would add to that, the more you witness suffering, the more you will really care. Be aware, be there, and listen. All right, so now we're in the 90s. Had another incredible, fortunate break. I got a call from a lawyer in the Federal Death Penalty Resource Council Project, a man by the name of Kevin McNally. The Federal Death Penalty Resource Council Project is a court-supported group of incredibly talented, dedicated attorneys who monitor and support all capital defense teams. All federal death penalty cases in the United States are monitored and supported by these attorneys. And Mr. McNally called me and assigned me to a prison murder case in Pennsylvania, in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. And the client was being held at the federal Supermax facility in Canyon City, Colorado. Many of you are aware of that facility. In fact, many in Santa Fe went up to Colorado Springs in 1994, in Florence, Colorado, 1994, and protested the opening of that incredibly draconian facility, 490 cells of solitary confinement. And that's where my client was held. I've been going to the federal Supermax up there almost every month since then, talking to clients and witnesses and getting firsthand accounts of what's going on up there. But that case ended successfully. And as a result, I was able to get involved in other similar cases involving capital punishment and prison conditions. But of course, I couldn't have done that work without the support and inspiration of other members of that project, the Federal Death Penalty Resource Council project. And then in 2006, I'll never forget the phone call from a member of the project, Dick Burr, who invited me to join the project. Had no idea what an incredible gift that was going to be. And because that was what got me involved in federal death penalty cases across the country, from New York to California, Texas to Colorado. I've been involved in over 100 federal capital prosecutions. Most of them involved serious prison cruelty and clients who faced the federal death penalty. Most of them involved clients who were held in solitary confinement. If you want to know what solitary confinement at that ADX facility in Canyon City, Colorado is really like. I urge you to look at a YouTube by Professor Laura Rovner from Denver University. Just Google ADX and Rovner, and you'll see a 10-minute TED Talk where she talks about what it's like. One story from going to ADX that I think says it all in one of our cases helps explain why my colleagues and I find this work so incredibly rewarding and self-sustaining. We were representing, well, we'll just call him Billy. Billy was facing the death penalty for a horrific murder he was involved in Pennsylvania. Because of the nature of his offense, he was not only sent to ADX, but Billy was put on what they call Range 13, 4 incredibly harsh cells that are basically underground, 4 cells that have held people like Ted Kaczynski and recently El Chapo. People are held without human contact or human touch. Their cells actually adjoin as a small recreation area that's separated by a mechanical door that will open so that they can go to this area without an escort from a prison guard. So in the course of representing Billy, we went down to tour where Billy was being held for the years before his trial, and he'd been there a couple of years. The tour had been postponed a couple of times because the expert witness that was with us had suffered serious health problems. And so when we got down there, we walked down this incredibly dark hallway to where these 4 cells are away from the rest of the solitary confinement units. And we really couldn't get to Billy's cell because, again, we were separated by a grill, and then there was a space before the grill for the cell where Billy actually lived. And it was pretty dark. The only light that we could see was a little desk light where Billy was doing some work. And so I sort of yelled through the bars, said, "Hey, Billy, I'm here with Mr. Bailey." And when Billy looked up, he said, "Hi, Mr. Bailey. How are you feeling? I heard you had some serious health problems." And I thought to myself, my God, Billy is facing the federal death penalty. He could be taken to Terre Haute, where he could be strapped to a table where lethal poisons are injected into his veins until he's dead. And the best outcome he could hope for is a life without the possibility of release sentence in this facility. And the first thing he thought of was how this man next to me was feeling. Well, I tell you, it was no accident that Billy reacted that way, because Billy had a practice. Billy had gotten meditation materials from the people like those who support the Prison Outreach Project and developed a practice. Billy feasted on Jack Kornfeld, believe it or not, and I'm sure that's responsible for why his first thought was, how was the man next to me feeling? I want to shift to the death penalty for a minute and give you some quick facts for those of you who haven't spent much time studying it here and thinking about what it represents here in the United States. It means that we're in the company of countries like China and Iran and Saudi Arabia. And a quick story about several years ago when I went to China to study the criminal justice system there, and I met with some law school professors in Beijing. And I was asking them about executions in China and asked them, was it true that China was executing upwards of 1,500 prisoners a year, every year executing 1,500? And these law school professors, who were wonderful people, and you can imagine what they were up against, paused and for a minute and sort of awkwardly looked at me and said, well, it's true we execute 1,500 people a year, but we have 1.5 billion people. And they quickly recited that they knew that George Bush, when he was a governor of Texas, had executed over 150 people, and Rick Perry, while he was governor, had executed 235 people. And based on the population in Texas, they were killing people at a higher rate than China. And when I got back to my hotel, I did the math, and you know what? They were right. That's what's been going on in the United States of America. Our execution process right now is really just a continuation, if you look at the numbers, of the sad and horrific history of lynching that we had in this country. Since 1976, the United States has executed over 1,500 prisoners. 34% of those prisoners executed were Black. We have right now, believe it or not, over 2,600 people on death row awaiting execution in the United States. 41% of those people awaiting execution are Black. In the federal death row, out of 55 people, only 22 are white. 58% are Black or Hispanic. Oh, by the way, since 1973, we found over 170 people on death row who were innocent. Do we have any idea how many innocent people we've executed? So, enough of the quick facts and statistics to help you understand what's been going on in our country. I'll tell you quickly a little about a typical case. You know, let's just get it out of the way. Our clients who are involved in these cases have, in most cases, committed horrific crimes, horrific homicides, sometimes multiple homicides. But as we know, every human being is more than the worst act they ever committed. And that's what our work involves, is studying the lives and the narratives of our clients. And you know, without exception, of these hundreds of cases that I've been involved in and the people that I've personally represented, the stories are almost always the same. A story of horrific, traumatic childhood abuse, of being involved in a juvenile justice system that either took them away from their parents or housed them because they didn't have parents, who subjected them to solitary confinement when they were juveniles, who graduated them to adult prisons, where they were placed in kill or be killed situations. 3 years ago, I was involved in a case in Texas where the homicide that occurred in solitary confinement. And you ask me, how could that happen? These men were in what they call rec cages, or basically dog kennels outside. And a prison guard brought another prisoner to the cage and said, "I have a gift for you," and placed a known sex offender in the cage with these prisoners. And of course, the prisoner was killed because the prisoners, if they had not carried out the homicide of that prisoner, would face murder at the hands of other prisoners themselves. Are you dealing with this reality? And then a short time after that, Attorney General Barr authorized the death penalty for the prisoners in that cage who were involved in that homicide. So they establish they create these conditions and then try to kill the survivors, the people who live through these experiences. At our trials, our trials begin with what they call the death penalty process, where citizens come in and are asked to engage in a process where they'll decide between whether a prisoner gets life in prison without the possibility of release or is executed. But the process starts with an examination of jurors' attitudes about the death penalty. And those who have substantial objection to imposing the death penalty are excused and are not allowed to participate in it. So imagine sitting next to someone who knows his fate is going to be decided by the process, and he's looking at the people who are going to decide his fate, and the people who have substantial objections to oppose it, not completely opposed to it, but just substantially objecting to the death penalty process. They're sent home before the process even starts. And yet they sit calmly through the process while their life stories are told. And they sit calmly in a courtroom, oftentimes with their ankles bolted to the floor that the trial is taking place in. And they sit calmly while the jurors who have deliberated for whether it's 45 minutes or 4 days come in and hand a verdict to a judge and ask, who asks them to stand and then reads whether they'll spend the rest of their life in prison or be executed in Terre Haute, Indiana. Those are our trials. That's what the people around the process witness and experience. You know, how do I get through this? Well, my friend Dick Burr, who I mentioned before, gave me a reading that I take with me every time I go to a prison and every time that I visit one of our clients. It's a reading that's called Invoking the Bodhisattva's Names. And I won't read the whole thing to you, but it basically tells me that I will listen deeply. Listen deeply. That's pretty hard for lawyers to do, to listen, because we're talking all the time. But to listen deeply, that I will look deeply, I will look without judgment, I will look with unprejudiced eyes. I will be present where there is darkness, suffering, and oppression, because that brings hope, relief, and liberation. Every time, whether I'm waiting in the room for my client to come up. And like I said, just be there and the experience takes care of the rest. So in the remaining 5 minutes, I want to talk about where we are, where we're headed, what we can do. We have a prison with solitary confinement going on here in Santa Fe with 300 prisoners. Federal's prisons around the country and state prisons have solitary confinement units. There are 2,600 people on death row waiting execution. I can't believe it. But as I said, tomorrow, there's an execution scheduled for Orlando Hall. Orlando Hall, a 49-year-old black man who was sentenced to death for something he did when he was 23 years old by an all-white jury. Another typical client with severe childhood trauma who had incompetent lawyers. He will be executed tomorrow in Terre Haute, Indiana. December 8th, the federal government still, even after what happened in the election, is intent on executing for the first time in over 70 years a woman, 52-year-old Elizabeth Montgomery, who was involved in a homicide in 2004, clearly, severely mentally ill woman who had suffered sexual trauma that was unimaginable as a child. She was sex trafficked by her own mother, gang raped by adults when she was a juvenile. That woman is scheduled for execution on December 8th. So, with that as a setting, how can I be hopeful? How can I possibly be hopeful? Well, we'll start small. In the prison cruelty department, President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris have said that they are going to end privatization of federal prisons. No longer will private companies be able to profit from inflicting cruelty on prisoners, and a dramatic change. The Attorney General, who will be sworn in to replace William Barr, will have control of the Justice Department and the Bureau of Prisons, which is part of it. He can directly affect the conditions of confinement in prisons, including solitary units. Hopefully, there will be legislation that addresses solitary confinement as we have in the legislature here in New Mexico. The death penalty, my friends, is disappearing. Half of our states have already stopped executing prisoners. Half of the states. You know, if we just look at what's happened with executions and people sentenced to death row, we see that the death penalty is disappearing. There were times in the 30s where we were averaging 170 executions a year, sometimes as many as 200. In 2020, there were only 14 executions. It's on its way out. It's disappearing. Death sentences. We used to have, in the 90s, upwards of over 300 executions a year. Last year, there were only 34 executions. As of January 2021, when we have regime change, the federal death penalty should come to a halt. The Democratic platform calls for the abolition of the death penalty. Both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have expressed their opposition to the death penalty. They've made their statements about how they oppose federal executions. They can control that. Lisa Montgomery, there's still hope. We have a number of senators begging the Justice Department to stop that execution. More and more people are getting behind that. And you and I can call everybody that we know to ask the federal government not to carry out the first execution of a 52-year-old woman. But even if that happens, and Lisa is executed, we know that there will be a backlash, that this suffering will produce the understanding and compassion that will lead to the elimination of the death penalty here in the United States. There's no question in my mind and in my heart. We can all support those efforts to eliminate prison cruelty and the death penalty. Support the prison outreach program of Upaya. I can't tell you how important the materials are. I can't tell you how many men at the federal Supermax in Canyon City have those materials, who build their practice, who are encouraged by contact from people from the outside world. To do what you can to encourage our legislators, people in Congress, to eliminate prison cruelty, eliminate the death penalty, support the families of people who are going through the process, victims as well as the people who are facing the loss of their loved ones. And I know, I've seen it change in over 45 years. It is so much better than it was when I first started doing this work, and I know it will continue to improve. Roshi Jonah, I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to talk about the work and to encourage people to get involved in the kind of action that it's going to take to cure prison cruelty and to once and for all eliminate government-sanctioned executions here in the United States. Thank you so much.